So last year I made a couple videos talking about book series and which ones I have DNF'd, which ones I wanted to continue in, and which ones I wanted to start. So now that it's a year later, I thought I would make an update. I have started new series since then. I have DNF'd some of them. I've also continued in some of the ones that I wanted to continue in. So I thought this would be a good time to update you on all of my series from the past year. This first video is going to be all about the book series that I am DNFing. And the way that these make it into this video is I have to have read the first book in its entirety. There are a bunch of books that I DNF'd before actually getting through the first book last year, and they were the start of the series, so I'm not going to talk about those because I couldn't even make it through the first book. These ones are books that I have made it through the first book, and I decided afterward that I don't want to continue in the series. So I'm just going to start with probably one of the more controversial ones, and that's the Sixth World series by Roanhorse. If you've been on my channel, you are very familiar with my hatred for this book. It's not fully hatred. I was just so disappointed and so annoyed because I wanted to love it so much. The concept is amazing. It's set in a Native American inspired world with monster hunters and vengeful gods, and I want to love it so much. The world was amazing. My issue is the main character. I cannot stand her tone of voice. It is so pretentious and cocky, and I hated it. It's in first person, and I was just stuck in this girl's head for the entire book, and it was torture. My brain was melting. I could not stand her as a character, so I really did not like the book. The only reason I could finish it was because it was so short, and I love the world so much and I wanted to love it. I just couldn't stand her. I can't see the story through her eyes. She's so annoying. And I found that this is a very common thing for me. I cannot stand cocky characters, especially if it's a first-person narrative and I have to listen to everything from their perspective. I hate it. Can't stand it. So, unfortunately, I will not be continuing this series, and as much as I love the world, it's not enough to get me to sit through her narration. A lot of people still really love it. If you don't have a problem with that sort of narration, I think you could really enjoy it. It's just me and my very particular tastes that it's not a book that works for me. Next, I have the Bright Ascendancy series by Arsenault Rivera. This is an Asian-inspired fantasy. It's also a female-female romance, and it's kind of their love letters as they're separated by various things, and also they're kind of gods. It was interesting while I was reading it, but also very weirdly paced and weirdly structured because it's in these letters back and forth and it's recounting their life together. And because of that sort of writing style and narrative setup, it's kind of awkward in its exposition because it's one person writing to the other, but they're explaining in very minute detail something that happened when they were both there. So if they were actually writing to each other, I'm sure they wouldn't have to go into that much detail, but if they didn't go into that detail, the reader wouldn't know what's happening. So I think that was just like a weird setup to start with. Also, it makes the world kind of hard to grasp because it's much harder to do world building when you're just recounting events to a person. Again, it's that balance of writing letters between two people while also explaining a story. So the world is kind of hard to grasp. I never fully understood how it worked, what was happening, where things were. I think there was some sort of magic in this world, but it was never really explained how it worked or like who could use it or anything. So I was really confused on that part. Also, all of the like politics and stuff, I couldn't really understand. I think it's more of a character-focused story, and you do spend a lot of time in their minds, but I still didn't really feel attached to them either. So a lot of this book just fell flat for me. I really liked the Asian influence, but everything else was just not written in a way that I was really enjoying. So I decided to DNF the series. Also, I've heard from other people who have finished it that they also didn't really particularly like the first book, and it doesn't really get any better from there. So I am just not going to waste my time on that. I also won't be finishing Gumiho by Kat Cho, and this one I actually did really like the first book, The Wicked Fox. It's about a Gumiho, a nine-tailed fox, set in contemporary Seoul, and she loses her fox speed and has to find a way to put it back into her body. And again, I love the world. I love the Korean mythology inspiration. It's so cool, and I loved that it was set in Seoul. I'd never read a book set in Seoul, and it was so interesting and so different from what I'm used to, so I really enjoyed that part. I also really enjoyed the mythology itself with the Gumiho and all of the other different creatures that you meet throughout the book. And I think it tackled some really unexpected and important topics about family and belonging, and it was a well-contained story. The plot kind of ended at the end of the book, and I honestly am not really sure where the second book is gonna go. And I don't really have that much of an interest in it either. I felt satisfied with this book, and it's not something that I just am dying to get back into, that I would want to read the second book, so I most likely am not going to be reading the second book. It's only a duology. I could technically read just one more book for a really quick, really enjoyable read. Maybe I will, but at this point, there are so many books that I would want to read more than this that I probably won't be reading it. I would still recommend The Wicked Fox. I think it's a little bit tropey, but it is that way on purpose because it's modeled after a K-drama, so if that's what you're looking for, this would be ideal. Next is another one I'm very sad about as well, and that's the Kyoshi Novels by FCE. I read the first book, The Rise of Kyoshi, and I was suffering through it. I hated it. Unfortunately, it's just too young for me. I know it's intended for a younger audience than I am, so I don't fault it for that. It's just not something that works for me. I thought the writing, the plot, and the characters were all just a little bit sloppy. So much of it was predictable, and yet so much of it still didn't even make sense. So it was a really weird combination. I think it's really good for a younger audience who are just looking for a fun time. For me, who really, really loves the Avatar world, I didn't even say what this is about. This is about the Avatar Kyoshi, which is one of the great avatars from the Avatar The Last Airbender series. It's her story and her origin story, but it just wasn't good. I wanted so much more from it, and unfortunately, it is a Nickelodeon show, so it is meant for younger people, and I'm just too old. I can appreciate things made for a younger audience. I've been reading a lot of middle grade lately, but this one was just getting on my nerves because it was so cheesy. It's so cheesy. So unfortunately, I won't be reading this trilogy as much as I would love more Avatar content. I think I just need to rewatch the series itself. A more recent series I'm DNFing is A Song Below Water by Bethany C. Morrow. I just read the first book with the same title a couple of months ago, and it was good. I was interested in the story, but I just was so confused the whole way through it. It's about a girl who is a siren, and all sirens in this world are black women, and they are very feared. They have to hide their identity. It's also about her sister, who has some weird magical happenings around her, and she doesn't know why or where she comes from. It's a really interesting look into the power that black women's voices have, and also trying to find a sense of belonging. And while I can appreciate it for the cultural messages, as a story, it just wasn't that well put together. I could never really understand how this world worked, because there are some magical creatures like sirens and gargoyles, but there also aren't some other ones like unicorns, and I don't know where the line is. I don't know what's actually real in this world and what isn't. I don't know how the society works around that or the politics of it, because it's only like lightly touched on and never really fully explained. So I was just confused the whole way through it about how certain things would be perceived in this world. I was also kind of annoyed at how it ended, which actually doesn't normally happen with books. I'm normally fine with how the author ends things, but this one I was actually just like, no, that shouldn't happen. You need to question that more. So unfortunately, it didn't leave a good taste in my mouth after that. Even though I was really interested in it when I was reading it, I wanted to continue and figure out what was happening, but after I finished, it was just kind of a confused mesh in my mind, and I just don't think I will be continuing the series. I also will not be continuing the Vessel series by Lisa A. Nichols. This is a sci-fi. It's kind of written as a literary fiction though. It's about a woman who comes back from a space trip 6 years after she should have, and all of her crew is dead and she can't remember what happened. It really explores how her arrival kind of shifts things in her family, who have thought she was dead for 6 years and the husband was actually moving on to another woman, and what you do when suddenly your wife is back who you thought was dead. also all of the politics around space travel and going on another trip. So it was a lot more focused on the characters and the repercussions of her arrival, which is why I say it feels more like a literary fiction than a hard sci-fi. There are sci-fi elements. You kind of go back and see what happened with her on this ship, but it feels like it kind of splits time half and half between like the sci-fi elements and then also the relationship elements. So that was really interesting. And I did really enjoy the mystery of this actually, but I still won't be continuing, partially because just sci-fi is much harder to hook me. It's not really my thing, and also partially because the ending was a little bit cheesy and I was not really a fan of where it was going from there anyway. So it's not something that I care to continue, but if you are more of a sci-fi reader, it might work for you. Next, I have the Kendra Chronicles, I think it's called. Beastly by Alex Flinn is the first book. I reread this recently because this is one of the books that I really, really loved as a kid, or whenever the heck this came out. And I only realized on this reread that there's a second book in the series that I never read, and I still don't plan to. Beastly is a Beauty and the Beast retelling, except it's in contemporary New York and it's from the perspective of the Beast. And this series follows the witch who cursed him and I guess her adventures after the end of this book. I'm not really sure, but it's not really something that I feel compelled to read either. I still really enjoyed Beastly, probably partially out of nostalgia, but I still think it was an interesting take on Beauty and the Beast. I don't normally see renditions from the Beast perspective, so if anything, that was its little bit of uniqueness, but nothing really made me want to continue the series, especially with the character work kind of being spotty, especially for the women. The character work on the Beast was fantastic, probably because you're in his perspective and you get to see him grow throughout it, but all of the women in the story were not very well done, and so I don't really have much hope for the witch. So there's that, and also it's just not something that's very interesting to me right now. There are a lot of other books that I really, really want to read, and this just doesn't make the cut. So I won't be continuing this series as much as I loved it as a kid. Another one that I'm upset about is Akata Witch by Nnedi Okorafor. I wanted to love this so badly. Again, the world is incredible. It's Nigerian inspired. It has magic. And I'm so sad. Everything about the tone of this was just really, really weird. It's meant to be like a YA middle grade style, but it doesn't feel like that for most of the book. The characters are hard to distinguish. The plot was almost non-existent until the very end, and then it was rushed through very unbelievably as well, and it was just kind of messy, and I was so sad about it. I love the idea of the leopard people and them being able to do magic, and they're all over the world, and it's all this Nigerian magic where they kind of are related to gods, and it's so cool. That part was fascinating, but everything else, the plot and the characters were just not there. I had a lot of issues with this book, and I go into it more in my SFF wrap-up if you want to see my thoughts, but just know that I am incredibly sad that this didn't work. So I will not be continuing the series. I think there's actually supposed to be a third book that's supposed to come out. I think the first book was written in like 2011, and then in 2018 it got a sequel, and now there's going to be another one. The timing on this is really weird, but I won't be reading them. I'm sorry. One book that was actually a lot of fun for the most part that I'm still not going to be continuing the series in is The Book of Nocera by Luke Raven. This is a self-pub book. You can find it for free on Amazon? Either Amazon or Playbooks, one of those. I will link it. It's a very interesting story. It's about a brother and sister who are writing a fantasy novel and making up their own fantasy world when one day they are suddenly trapped in their own fantasy world. It's kind of the classic people from the contemporary world getting stuck in a fantasy world and having to go on an adventure, and sometimes that's just a lot of fun. I think the concept was really cool, and for the most part I really enjoyed reading it. There were just some issues with the characters and the plot again. So the characters were kind of, their interactions were really unbelievable. They were very extremely stereotypical. So when one of the characters was having a conversation with someone, they would just like out of nowhere burst into tears, and it's like, I did not expect that. Based on what you were saying, this is really weird. So there were just some issues with the character dynamics, especially in the side characters. The two main characters, the brother and the sister, were pretty good. It was just the side characters and their reactions that were Kind of funny because they were so unexpected. There's also another thing with the plot where it, again, didn't really have one to start with, and then it all just like rushed at the end in a really weird climax that didn't feel like a climax. So yeah, it's a lot of fun, but it could definitely use some work, so I won't be continuing the series. I am also DNFing the Vine Witch series by Luanne G. Smith. I did just recommend this in my Compelling Atmosphere video, the books that will transport you to another world. However, that is a very specific recommendation for people who are looking for a beautiful world and beautiful atmosphere, but don't really mind that the plot and the characters were not that well done. This is set in historic France, and it follows a witch who has just broken out of a curse, and when she returns home to her vineyard, she finds that someone is living in her house and her vineyard is failing. I cannot explain to you how much I loved the setting and the atmosphere in this book. It is beautiful and pastoral and peaceful and calm, and it filled me with so much comfort that I really loved the setting. I loved the idea of all these different kinds of witches and how they all just like peacefully work together and live their lives. It's beautiful. Unfortunately, the characters and the plot are not that well done. The character development is kind of non-existent. It's not shown on page. You get told a bunch of things happen and these people change their minds, but you never actually see it. The plot also is way too big of a scope for what the book felt like. The tone shifted like dramatically from the beginning in the small little pastoral town and went to this like epic world-breaking I don't know what, that it didn't fit well. And so while I can recommend it for people who are very specifically interested in setting and atmosphere, I can't really recommend it overall because it's just not a well-constructed book. And lastly, I have a romance series here. It's the Castles Ever After series by Tessa Dare. I know technically you can read romance just outside of series in different orders and you don't have to continue fully in series. And actually I read, I think, the first and the third books in this series. I skipped the second one, but it's just, I've decided that Tessa Dare isn't really for me. The series overall is just about girls who are suddenly given castles by this, I think he's like a godfather or an uncle or some sort of benefactor to a bunch of these different girls, and he has a bunch of castles to give away. So a bunch of girls end up living in castles and it's their romance with whoever, depending on the story. These were a lot of fun and I enjoyed reading them, but it's just not really something that I'm super interested in going back to. There's something about Tessa Dare's writing that just doesn't really interest me that much. It's a little simple, and also her settings aren't as well developed as I would like in a historical. A lot of the time I just would forget that I'm reading a historical romance. It felt very contemporary, minus just castles being involved. So I never really felt fully immersed in the story like I would like to be when I'm reading a historical. So unfortunately, it's just a kind of taste thing. I still think they're really good books. A lot of people really like them. They're very light and fluffy and really fun and easy to read. It's just, I would like something a little bit more atmospheric, I guess, in my historical romance. So those are all of the book series I have DNF'd since making the last video. It's quite a lot, unfortunately. Actually, I didn't realize how many book series I started and just didn't want to continue with. I would much rather start series that I do eventually want to continue with, but it doesn't always work out that way. You can't win every time, and it is what it is. So I will also be posting videos talking about the book series that I have completed or caught up in, and also the series that I still want to continue. So keep an eye out for those. But that's it for now, so I will see you later. Bye.